There are many important ideas having to do with the topic of information from heaven, and I want to get into just one of these. I'd like to talk to you about more of them, but I don't think that I can do a sufficient job without a collection of prerequisite ideas that I can't go into right now. But here's one that I think is pretty straightforward, but I don't think a lot of people realize it. Correct me if you've heard about this before or thought about this, but it goes something like this. This right now is the only time in history where almost all people on this planet have almost completely free access to all information shared by all people on this planet. And that probably sounded more complicated than it needs to be. But let me explain it like this. Any other time in history when a person was sharing information, they were doing so face to face, unless it was through print. And print is something that wasn't available, at least as an inexpensive commodity for almost all of history. And so, independent of the value of whatever information is being shared, I don't know if you've ever thought about the fact that were God to make available any information today, odds are, not just to one person, odds are that pretty much everybody on the planet would have free access to it. And how different this is from times past matters a whole lot. Why? So if we were having this conversation, 1,500 years ago, you would have to know me personally. And in order to know me personally, you'd have to live really close by to me or happen to that's pretty much it. Either I would have to move or you would have to move. So we'd end up living close to each other in order for us to have this conversation. Furthermore, there are all sorts of rules that God has for how and when information can be shared. And those rules are about as different in our day as the technology is that enables this sharing. So I'm not saying any of this as succinctly as I could if I were to take time and write it up, which I have, and just read it to you, but that's for books later. And I can talk about this because I don't think it's tied to anything in particular that you need to understand in order to understand this that I haven't talked about publicly. I'm not sure if you're getting the point, but the point is that you have available a tremendous resource in the internet today, because you have access to things that I probably almost, I could say absolutely, would not tell you if we were face to face. And the reason that you're able to access that information is because of the hope that there's somebody out there who is ready for this and deserves it. And so in the meantime, everybody else can hop on here and hear this. So there's a much bigger picture with these themes. But it's probably too much to get into, but it has a lot to do with correctly understanding what's going on in the end times. To put it way too simply, to oversimplify it greatly, almost all of history, for almost all of history, the trajectory of the world has been crafted to minimize the flow of information. That's probably a shocker for people. It might be hard to understand, but Great lengths were undertaken to minimize the amount of information that was available to I don't want to say common people, but everybody on earth except for, the Moseses and the Abrahams, which were few and far between. In the end times, that all flips around, and it's a deluge of information. Now, you are probably aware that the vast majority of information that's available today is not helpful. Much of it is much worse than neutral. The information that most people in the world crank out is not used for good, and a lot of times it doesn't contain good. But where there is signal, there's also noise. Noise tends to co-occur with signal, so maybe it's better to say where there's noise, there's also true signal. And so buried amidst these tons and tons of useless videos and even books and things, there's actually some really important stuff. And you have access to that stuff right now. And you will have access until the internet starts getting limited, I'll say, and then eventually it won't be available at all. So through censorship and other things, it will be curtailed, and then eventually you won't have it. So it's very important to think about what you're doing with this information and how much effort you put into consuming things that are worth consuming. I think I've heard from more than one person that it's hard to keep up on these videos, which is really interesting to hear, because it's a lot harder to make them than it is to watch them. But, and much more so for the books, of course. But the situation is kind of like you've got what feels like enough to eat right now, but someone's plopped you into the middle of a ripe field and given you instruments to harvest and told you that there's going to be a time where there will be no field and no instruments to harvest, but you get to keep everything that you harvest until then. And so what seems like too much effort right now to process these things, it's going to seem a lot different later when they're not around. So there are many consequences to the availability of information right now. And one of those is going to be that it will flip once again and you will not have access to it. And so you'll retain what you've heard before, but to get more, the cost will be astronomically more than it is today. So I hope that you think about that, and you think about this is yet another instance of this idea of thinking about what you would have done differently in the past, trying to project into the future and some of the conditions that we know will happen, and look back from that future self and wonder what you would have done differently if you could come back and do it again, because things will be very different. Anyway, hope that's useful.